Hi, this is Cindy. I'm going to go over a few of the exercises from Chapter 7 in the Coding Handbook. I won't go over all of them, but I want to do a couple with you so that you can understand more and more how to use the code book, how to look up codes, how to apply the guidelines when you're assigning a code, and what I'm expecting from you on the exercises in the future, which you will submit. I will be toggling between this PowerPoint that I've created and the code book. The code book has the document camera on it. I'll try to make it as smooth as I can, but it isn't always as smooth as I would like it to be. We'll start with exercise 7.1, number 1, which is influenza with gastroenteritis. If we go to the tabular, we're going to find influenza as a main term, and then it'll be indented one level with indented another level, gastroenteritis. So when you are looking for the pathway in the answer key for the exercises that you will complete in this class, this is how you will see the way the alphabetic index looks. So now I'm going to toggle to, here's our code book, and you see influenza with gastroenteritis, J11.2. So now that we have that code, we're going to go to the tabular and find 11.2. And what I've learned is moving the code book and not the camera is the best way to go. And here is J11.2, influenza due to unidentified influenza virus with gastrointestinal manifestations. So that is the first one. After you have found a code, before you assign that code, I want you to be able to look at guidelines and know how a certain guideline might guide you to selecting the right code. The guideline that I think addresses this particular exercise is assign only the combination code when that code fully identifies the diagnostic conditions involved or when the alphabetic index so directs, and that is Coding Guideline 1B9. So let me go back to the code book just to be sure everybody's on the same page. When I'm talking about guidelines, I'm talking about the official coding guidelines. And under general coding guidelines, which I mentioned, it started with Roman numeral 1. This is where I get that from. This is the 1. And then you go to B, which is your general coding guidelines. Here's B. And then 9 is your combination code here. So when you are, my suggestion is before you start completing your exercise that you would read through the guidelines for a specific chapter, then look at your exercises, and after you have selected the codes, go back to the guidelines just to make sure you're not missing anything before you assign that final. Okay, the next one is exercise 7.2, number 3, combined spinal cord degeneration with anemia due to a dietary vitamin B12 deficiency. The main term in this diagnosis is the degeneration. Sometimes students ask me, how do you know what the main term is? Well, you just start looking up words. And if you don't find what you need with one term, then go to a different term until you find what you need. But I know that this one is degeneration. Then degeneration is your main term, combined is your first subterm, with anemia due to dietary vitamin B12, D51.3. You notice there's 2 codes here. The first code is your etiology code, the second code is your manifestation code. So let's go to the document camera, and you see degeneration here, combined spinal cord with anemia due to dietary vitamin B12, and there's the 2 codes. So we're going to look up both of those codes, D51.3 and G32.0. Here we go. D51.3, other dietary B12 deficiency anemia. So if you wonder, where's that other? What's that referring to? Well, up above here we talk about anemia due to an intrinsic factor deficiency, anemia due to selective B12 malabsorption problems, the transcobalamin 2 deficiency, which I've never heard of, but there you go, And D51.3 is other dietary vitamin B12 deficiency. I said D51.3, and I really shouldn't be saying that because there may be many characters in a code, so I really should be saying D51.3 or D51.3, however you prefer to refer to that dot or that point. So I will correct myself and say I should have said D51.3, and that would be your first code. And then G32 is your other degenerative disorders of the nervous system and diseases classified elsewhere. And you notice this is called an instructional note. Code first underlying disease, which we did when we had our codes. We had that D code first, that's the anemia. You see here's some examples. So you code first your underlying disease and then this code, G32. Codes that have this phrase, in diseases classified elsewhere, those can never be used as a primary or a principal diagnosis. They're always going to be a secondary diagnosis. So let's go back. And now let's look at what guidelines would work best. And this one is what I've selected. Coding Guideline 1A13. And this is when certain conditions have an underlying etiology and multiple body system manifestations due to the underlying etiology. And this convention requires that that underlying condition be sequenced first, followed by the manifestation. So this is what I've done, and this is where I've quoted that guideline. The next diagnosis is diabetic neuralgia due to type 2 diabetes mellitus or mellitus, however you prefer to say that, patient on insulin. I've heard it pronounced both ways. I'm not sure which is correct. I typically say mellitus, but whatever. I know what you mean. We know, or you will know, from finding your diabetes codes in the alphabetic index that they are classified by type. So you can see here on the pathway, diabetes type 2 with neuralgia takes you to E1142. So let's go to our alphabetic index, and you see here, maybe you don't see, I am in, go all the way to the top, diabetes type 2 with neuralgia, E1142. I also want to bring to your attention, see my little note over here? This is a note that I made when I was reviewing a coding clinic from the first quarter of 2013, and the instructions were to code type 2 diabetes with ketoacidosis as E13.1-. Why is this in here? Because this was something I noticed in coding clinic that I had seen in some medical record documentation. So to be sure that I didn't forget that this is how we had been instructed to code this, I put a note right here in these with diagnoses here. So in future publications of ICD-10, ketoacidosis is going to go in here, right in here, and it'll be identified as the coder will know to use E13.1. So move back to our code E1142. We're going to find that code in our tabular. E1142, type 2 diabetes with diabetic polyneuropathy. You may say, well, polyneuropathy was not one of the words we were looking up. No, it isn't, but neuralgia is, and neuralgia is right here. Whenever you see a descriptor under a code, it's just telling you this is another way that you might see this expressed in the documentation, and it's the same code, E1142. So now let's go back here. And we want to look at a patient on insulin. We haven't coded any with the Z codes yet, but it's a good idea to not be afraid to start looking for codes, even if it's outside the chapter that we're studying. We're going to find long-term. I'm going to try to find it before I focus the camera, so maybe it'll be a little bit smoother. So in our alphabetic index, we're going to look up long-term as our main term, drug therapy, insulin, Z79.4. So when we long-term use, go down till we get to insulin, Z79.4. Take that code, Go all the way back to the back of the code book for our Z code, and all the way in the corner of long-term use of insulin, Z79.4. So we know that those two codes are correct for this particular diagnosis. Neuralgia due to diabetes, patient on insulin. And here's the guideline that I've chosen to go with this particular diagnosis, and that would be the combination code, Coding Guideline 1B9, which is the same one we had used earlier. You know what I'm expecting. When I say pathway, this is what we're looking at. When I say rationale, this is what I'm looking at. In this case, it was a guideline. It could have been an instructional note or something like that. The next diagnosis is subacute and chronic pyelonephritis. And I have a little note here to remind you that unless the index or the tabular indicates otherwise, the terms acute and subacute are coded the same. Our pathway, we're going to find the main term of pyelonephritis, acute, and pyelonephritis chronic. So we'll take that, we will go to alphabetic index. We have pyelonephritis. I'm having trouble with that word today. Acute is N10 and chronic N11.9. And you see how acute and chronic are at the same indentation level? That's important. So you'll see that in the guideline when we talk about it. It's going to mention terms being at the same indentation level. So now we'll go back in the tabular and look up our codes. Be sure we've got the right code. Here is N10, and even though they use different words, our word is right here. So we know that that is the right code for the acute pyelonephritis. And then when we come for chronic, we're going to choose this one because not otherwise specified. The codes above here talk about specific places where the obstruction or inflammation might be. Our documentation didn't give us any of that, so we're going to choose this less specific N11.9 code for this diagnosis. So now let's see, what did I choose for the guideline? And it would be this one. Coding Guideline 1B8, if the same condition is described as both acute and chronic, and separate sub-entries exist in the alphabetical index at the same indentation level, you code both and sequence the acute code first, which we did. We put our acute code in 10 first, then our chronic code in 11.9 second. Now, of course, if you were reading medical documentation, this would just be a phrase in a larger volume of the documentation, whether it was in history and physical, discharge summary, operative report, whatever it might be. As you're learning to code, we just give you these one-liners, but little by little, as you become more comfortable with the code book, I will be giving you longer exercises so that you get used to reading medical record documentation and knowing which terms need to be coded. Next one we're going to look at is cervicitis. Okay, for cervicitis, the diagnosis is acute and chronic. Our pathway is cervicitis is our main term, and acute and chronic on the same line, N72. So when we look at that in the code book, you can see what I'm talking about. Here's a cervicitis, here's acute, here's chronic. Both conditions have the same code, N72. So we'll look up that code. There we go. And it's right here. Inflammatory disease of the cervix uteri. N72. Notice this use additional code. If we had been given the organism responsible for this infection or this inflammation, we would code that. And it would be somewhere in this B95 to B97 category. But we weren't given that, so in this case, we don't code that. Okay, that's what I'm going to do so far for Chapter 7 exercises. I will do a second part 2 in the next recording.